Alright guys, I didn't show the process as it's fairly straightforward, but I just went ahead and cut some pieces for the materials that we're going to be using to make our knife. And what I have here is a piece of 1095, it's 70 thousandths thick by I think about 4 inches wide. And I cut, I'd say probably about a 3-inch wide section off of that. I had about a 4-foot section originally, just cut enough for 2 blades and 2 back springs. I'll show you that when we trace them. And then I just have a small sheet of 3/16 inch thick black G10. And what we're going to be making is a shadow pattern slip joint. And what that means is there's not going to be any bolsters or liners, stainless liners or otherwise, for this knife. And I found that just these materials alone are really quite adequate for a nice, strong, and solid slip joint. So what we're going to do now that we have some more manageable pieces to trace our patterns on, we're going to go ahead and take out our template that we made and start transferring this to cut out into our pieces. Now I also didn't show this step, but I went ahead and put some die chem on one side. And you could really use almost anything from a large Sharpie to some spray paint, or even if you just have some dye or some ink to paint onto your steel. This just makes things show up a little bit better and gives you a little bit more crisp of a line to cut out on your bandsaw or hacksaw or however you do that. So we'll go ahead and start with the blades. I have my template here. I'll go ahead and just line it up. Now one thing you do want to keep in mind, depending on how straight your steel is to begin with, usually when steel is sheared at the mill or at the distributor, it's going to have a little bit of a bend in it from one end to the other. So anything you can do to straighten that out before you get started is really going to pay itself in dividends in your finished product. Another thing you can kind of do, since the steel normally bends lengthwise and not so much widthwise, is you can cut off and kind of use the width of the steel rather than the length, as that's usually going to be fairly flat. Again, this was this wide to begin with, so it's fairly flat across that end. Any bending would be more along this way. So I kind of use that to my advantage here. But do keep in mind, depending on how this was sheared, it may taper off at the edges just a little bit as well. So make sure you leave yourself a little bit of extra room there to compensate for any dimensional changes on the edges as a byproduct of the shear or the way that it was cut. So we got a little bit of extra room there to play with. We'll go ahead and line our blade up here. And I like to use a pair of vice grips or even a small C-clamp to kind of hold it in place. Even a pony clamp or a spring clamp would work. But I think this is probably the fastest way. And go ahead and line that up. And I apologize in advance if this is kind of boring. I know this is real straightforward and really needs little to no explanation, but we'll go ahead and show the process anyway. Let's get on either side of the vice grips. And probably one of the more critical dimensions is going to be your back spring area here. Sure we get that as close and as exact as possible. And it goes without saying, but just make sure this is securely in place and not pivoting one way or the other on you when you're making your traces. Now this is where your smaller holes really come in handy when you make your templates, as it really doesn't leave a whole lot of room for error when transferring your hole. with your center scribe. And I could have actually made it even a little smaller than that. But I can be fairly confident that that hole is going to be on center now, as long as I was careful to drill it correctly to begin with. So that pattern is traced. Go ahead and do another blade, and again, obviously just make sure that you leave yourself enough room to cut this out with your bandsaw or your hacksaw, however you choose to end up doing that. Go from this end. Take extra care around your tang. And one thing I'll go ahead and emphasize right now, before I forget, is you're going to want to leave a little bit of extra material in some key places when you're cutting out your knife pieces. One of those is going to be what is called the kick area right here. This will establish or determine where your point ends up when you close your knife, as well as how the back spring zeroes out on the back of the blade. There'll be more discussion on that later. Almost forgot my hole. But you want to be able to work your way into that when you're assembling your knife. And the only way to do that is to start with some extra material. Go ahead and make sure this hole's in the right spot. You want to leave yourself some extra material here, as well as on the bottom. And we'll kind of establish the geometry on our back spring area in the next step after we rough cut this. But just remember, leave yourself a little bit of extra room, just so that you're not starting out with too little or not enough material when it goes time to fit your blade together. You can always take away, it's really hard to add once you've already cut it. So those are the knife clip point blades. Go ahead and do our back spring. Your back spring is also another place to leave some extra material. Especially on the outside where you can flush it up to your handle scales. You also want to leave just a little bit of extra on the end. So that you can square it up with the tang of your knife blade. And I'll go over all this in more detail as we get there. But again, just take care when transferring, and keep in mind where extra material will be needed. And I'm actually going to need to cut a little